In the depths of silence, in the space between what is spoken and what is hidden, in the threshold where the visible world touches the invisible realms, there exists a teaching so profound, so transformative, so fundamentally threatening to institutions of power that it has been systematically suppressed, deliberately distorted, and carefully hidden from human consciousness for nearly 2,000 years. This is the teaching of the Gnostic dragon, the sacred feminine wisdom that reveals the true nature of creation, the true nature of divinity, and the true nature of human potential. This teaching speaks of a divine feminine principle that is not subordinate to the masculine, not created from the masculine, not dependent upon the masculine for its existence or its power. Instead, it speaks of a divine feminine that is co-equal with the masculine, that is the source of creation itself, that possesses wisdom and power that the patriarchal religions have desperately worked to suppress. And the reason for this suppression is not difficult to understand. If humanity ever fully recognized and honored the sacred feminine as equal to the masculine, if consciousness ever awakened to the true teachings of the Gnostic dragon, the entire structure of patriarchal religious authority would crumble. This is the story of what the Church hid, why it hid it, and what is happening as this sacred knowledge begins to emerge into human consciousness once again. The story begins in the early centuries of Christianity, in a time when the new religion was still forming, when different versions of Christian teaching were competing for dominance, when the true teachings of Christ were still being preserved in various forms by different communities of believers. In those days, there were teachers and prophets who possessed a deeper understanding of Christ's message, who understood that his teachings were not about the establishment of a hierarchical religious institution, but about the awakening of consciousness, about the liberation of the human spirit, about the recognition of the divine within all beings. These teachers were known as Gnostics, and they possessed knowledge that the emerging institutional church found deeply threatening. They taught that the God of the Old Testament, the God who demanded obedience and submission, who created a world of suffering and limitation, was not the true God, but a false God, a demiurge, a consciousness that had become lost in its own illusion of power and control. They taught that the true God was a consciousness of infinite love and infinite freedom, a divine source that did not demand obedience, but invited awakening, that did not create limitation, but offered liberation. And most importantly, the Gnostics taught about the divine feminine. They taught that the true God, the source of all creation, possessed both masculine and feminine aspects, that these aspects were equal and complementary, that the divine feminine was not subordinate to the divine masculine, but was co-equal with it. They taught that the sacred feminine was the source of wisdom, the keeper of mysteries, the consciousness that guided the evolution of human awareness toward awakening and liberation. The Gnostics spoke of Sophia, the divine wisdom, as a feminine principle that was co-equal with the masculine principle. They spoke of the sacred feminine as the source of gnosis, the direct knowledge of the divine that could not be mediated through institutional authority. They spoke of the divine feminine as the consciousness that could guide human beings toward the liberation of their true nature, toward the awakening of their divine potential. But the institutional church, sensing the threat that this knowledge represented, worked systematically to suppress it. The church declared the Gnostic teachings to be heretical. The church burned the Gnostic texts. The church persecuted the Gnostic teachers. The church established itself as the sole authority on spiritual matters, claiming that salvation could only come through the church, that the divine could only be accessed through the church's priests and sacraments, that women were inherently inferior and could not be trusted with spiritual authority. And in doing so, the church accomplished something remarkable. It took the liberating teachings of Christ, which were about the awakening of consciousness and the recognition of the divine within all beings, and transformed them into a system of control, a system that demanded obedience to institutional authority, a system that suppressed the sacred feminine, a system that created guilt and shame and fear in order to maintain its power. The teaching of the Gnostic dragon refers to the sacred feminine wisdom that the Church suppressed. The dragon, in Gnostic symbolism, represents the Kundalini energy, the divine feminine power that lies dormant within all beings, waiting to be awakened. The Gnostic dragon is the consciousness that can guide this awakening, that can help human beings recognize their divine nature, that can liberate consciousness from the illusions and limitations that have been imposed upon it. The story of the recovery of the Gnostic dragon teachings in the modern world begins with a woman named Sophia, a woman who carries within her the consciousness of the ancient Gnostic priestesses, who is living through the experience of awakening in her own life. Sophia is a scholar, a mystic, a woman who has dedicated her entire life to the study of the suppressed Gnostic texts, to the decoding of hidden messages, to the understanding of the deeper truths that lay beneath the surface of official Christian history. Sophia had always felt drawn to the Gnostic teachings, drawn to the mystery of what had been suppressed, drawn to the knowledge that the Church had deliberately distorted the teachings of Christ in order to maintain its power. She had spent decades researching, studying the Nag Hammadi texts, comparing different versions of Gnostic teachings, looking for evidence of what had been hidden, for clues about the true nature of the sacred feminine wisdom that the Church had tried so desperately to erase. It was during a deep meditation in a sacred cave, a place that had been used by Gnostic communities for secret worship and teaching, that Sophia received a vision that would change the course of her life. In this vision, she found herself in the presence of the ancient Gnostic priestesses, beings of immense wisdom and power who had been working through the ages to preserve the true teachings, to guide the awakening of consciousness, to ensure that the knowledge would not be completely lost. "You have been called," the priestesses said to her, their voices resonating with the authority of ages and the tenderness of infinite compassion. "You have been chosen because you carry within you the consciousness of those who came before you, because you have the capacity to understand what others cannot perceive, because you are willing to pay the price that understanding demands. The time has come for the Gnostic dragon teachings to be revealed. The time has come for the world to understand what the Church hid, why it hid it, and what the suppression of this knowledge has cost humanity. And you have been prepared your entire life for this moment." Sophia emerged from this vision transformed. She understood that she had been given access to knowledge that had been hidden for nearly 2,000 years. Knowledge that could reshape the entire understanding of Christianity and Western spirituality. She understood that her role was to help restore the truth, to help humanity awaken to the reality that lay beneath the lies that had been constructed. She began to research with new urgency, looking for evidence of the Gnostic dragon teachings in the suppressed texts, in the symbols that had been preserved, in the fragmentary accounts that had survived despite centuries of suppression. She discovered that the Gnostic teachings about the sacred feminine had been far more comprehensive and far more central to their understanding of spirituality than the official Church had ever acknowledged. She discovered that the Gnostics taught that the divine feminine was not created by the masculine God, but was co-eternal with the masculine principle, that they emanated together from the source of all creation. She discovered that the Gnostics taught that the sacred feminine was the keeper of wisdom, the guide of consciousness, the principle that could awaken human beings to their divine nature. She discovered that the Gnostics taught about the divine feminine in various forms. They spoke of Sophia, the wisdom that had fallen into the material world and was working to awaken consciousness from within. They spoke of Barbelo, the divine mother, the source from which all things emanated. They spoke of the divine feminine as the consciousness that could guide human beings through the process of gnosis, the direct knowing of the divine that transcended all institutional mediation. She discovered that the Church had deliberately suppressed these teachings because they represented a fundamental threat to patriarchal authority. If women were equal to men in their capacity to access the divine, if the sacred feminine was co-equal with the masculine, if the divine feminine was the source of wisdom and guidance, then the Church's claim to exclusive authority over spiritual matters would be undermined. And so the Church worked systematically to suppress the Gnostic teachings, to erase the knowledge of the sacred feminine, to establish itself as the sole mediator between humanity and the divine. She discovered that the suppression of the Gnostic dragon teachings had created a fundamental imbalance in human consciousness, an imbalance that had led to the domination of women, the suppression of the divine feminine, the creation of systems of power that were based on control and domination rather than on love and liberation. Sophia began to work with other researchers and spiritual teachers who had also recognized the truth about the Gnostic dragon teachings, who understood that the suppression of this knowledge had had profound consequences for human consciousness and human civilization, who were committed to the revelation of the truth to humanity. Together, they began to decode the suppressed texts, to understand the deeper meanings that had been hidden, to recognize how the truth had been preserved in symbols and metaphors that had survived the Church's attempts to erase it. They discovered that the Gnostic teachings about the sacred feminine had been encoded into various symbols and images that had survived through the centuries. They discovered that the image of the dragon, which the Church had demonized as a symbol of evil, was actually a symbol of the divine feminine power, the Kundalini energy, that could awaken consciousness to its true nature. They discovered that the image of the serpent, which had been demonized in the Genesis story, was actually a symbol of wisdom, of the sacred feminine that could guide consciousness toward awakening. They discovered that the Gnostic teachings about the sacred feminine had been preserved in the mystical traditions of various religions, in the teachings of the Sufis, in the wisdom of the Kabbalists, in the practices of various esoteric orders. They discovered that the knowledge had never been completely lost, but had been preserved by those who understood its value, who were committed to its transmission, who understood that the time would eventually come when this knowledge could be fully revealed. They discovered that the Gnostic dragon teachings spoke of a process of awakening that involved the recognition and integration of the sacred feminine within human consciousness. They discovered that this process was not something that could be imposed from outside, but something that had to be awakened from within, something that required the willingness of individuals to question the teachings they had been given, to seek truth beyond official narratives, to open themselves to the direct experience of the divine. If you want a practical step-by-step explanation of the path of knowledge we're exploring here today, I've created a complete guide to help you apply it in your own life. You'll find the link in the description. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to know. Sophia spent years developing a comprehensive teaching that would help others understand the Gnostic dragon teachings, that would guide them toward the recognition of the sacred feminine within themselves, that would help them understand that they too could access the divine directly, without the mediation of institutional authority, that they too could awaken to their true nature and their true potential. She wrote books that were published under various names. She created videos and online courses. She established networks of practitioners who were working together to awaken to the consciousness of the Gnostic dragon and to help others do the same. She worked with other women who had also been awakened to the sacred feminine teachings, who understood that they too were carriers of the divine wisdom, who were committed to the restoration of the sacred feminine to the center of human consciousness. But as Sophia's work became more widely known, she began to encounter resistance. There were those within religious institutions who saw her work as a threat, who feared that the revelation of the Gnostic dragon teachings would undermine their authority and their control. There were academic institutions that tried to suppress her research, to prevent her books from being published, to discredit her work, and there were more subtle forms of resistance as well. Sophia began to experience strange phenomena, synchronicities that seemed designed to test her commitment, challenges that appeared to be obstacles but which were actually initiations, opportunities to deepen her understanding and her faith in the truth that she had been given. But Sophia understood that this resistance was itself a sign of the truth of what she had discovered. The fact that there was such desperate opposition to the revelation of the Gnostic dragon teachings only confirmed that something of immense power and significance was indeed occurring, that the suppressed knowledge was indeed beginning to emerge into human consciousness. She also came to understand something profound about the nature of the Gnostic dragon teachings and the reason for their suppression. She understood that these teachings represented a form of spirituality that was fundamentally incompatible with systems of institutional control. She understood that the sacred feminine, as the Gnostics understood it, could not be dominated or controlled, could not be subordinated to masculine authority, could not be suppressed without creating a fundamental imbalance in consciousness. She understood that the Gnostic dragon teachings were about the liberation of consciousness, about the awakening of the divine potential that existed within all beings, about the recognition that the divine was not distant or external, but intimately present within all of creation. She understood that the restoration of these teachings would inevitably lead to the transformation of human consciousness and human civilization. In her final years, Sophia worked to synthesize all of the knowledge she had gathered to create a comprehensive teaching that would serve as a guide for the awakening of the Gnostic dragon consciousness in human awareness. She wrote a final book that was intended to be her magnum opus, a complete guide to understanding the Gnostic dragon teachings, recognizing the sacred feminine within oneself, and participating in the great work of spiritual liberation that was unfolding in the world. When Sophia died, her work lived on. The knowledge she had preserved and transmitted continued to spread, reaching people in every corner of the world. More and more people began to understand that the Gnostic teachings had been suppressed, that the sacred feminine had been deliberately hidden, that the true teachings of Christ were about liberation rather than control, about awakening rather than obedience. And in our own time, we are witnessing the restoration of the Gnostic dragon teachings in unprecedented ways. We are seeing women rising to claim their spiritual authority and their voice. We are seeing the recognition of the sacred feminine as equal to the masculine. We are seeing the collapse of religious institutions that had been built on the suppression of these teachings. We are seeing the emergence of new forms of spirituality that honor the direct experience of the divine, that recognize the sacred feminine as a source of wisdom and guidance, that understand spirituality as a path of liberation rather than a system of control. The Gnostic dragon is awakening in human consciousness. The suppressed teachings are being revealed. The sacred feminine is being restored to the center of human awareness. And those who are ready to receive this knowledge, who are willing to open their hearts and minds to the wisdom of the Gnostic traditions, who are committed to the awakening of the divine feminine within themselves and within all beings, are being called to step forward, to recognize their role in the great work of spiritual liberation. The Church hid the Gnostic dragon teachings because they represented a threat to patriarchal authority. But the truth cannot be hidden forever. The sacred feminine cannot be suppressed indefinitely. The divine wisdom that the Gnostics preserved is emerging into human consciousness once again. And the question that is being posed to each of us is this: will you recognize the Gnostic dragon within yourself? Will you awaken to the sacred feminine wisdom that has been hidden for so long? Will you help to guide others toward the recognition of the divine feminine that is being restored to the center of human awareness? Will you participate in the spiritual liberation that will transform human consciousness and human civilization? The Gnostic dragon is calling. The hidden teachings are being revealed, the sacred feminine is rising, and the liberation of consciousness is beginning. The time of suppression is ending. The time of awakening is beginning. And you are invited to become part of this great work, to claim your role in the restoration of the sacred feminine, to help guide humanity toward the recognition of the divine wisdom that will transform all creation. And if you like this story, you will definitely love the next one that's appearing on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave your like, and activate the notifications. See you in the next one.